This is a discussion of something that I think needs to be refined in the Austrian Economics concept of entrepreneurial error and the consequential cluster of errors that is referred to that results in capital investments in things that are not needed, would be malinvestments. And the thing I think that needs to be corrected in that is that entrepreneurs aren't really making errors from their perspective. It's not entrepreneurial error. It's not like they've been tricked into doing something that's against their interest. They're still doing things that are in their interest. For example, you could have an Austrian economist run a lumber store, that's his job, running a lumber store. And he knows that there's a housing boom that's in progress, and he knows it's not sustainable, but he is making good profits at his lumber store, selling to contractors and other people that are making houses. And he sells other things, paint and linoleum floor tile and flashings for the roof, gutter materials, bricks, concrete, all kinds of things, plumbing. And he knows that this is a housing boom. He knows that there has been this credit created through a central bank that now there's just too much credit, and it's creating an unsustainable boom, and houses are being built that aren't needed if the particular boom is in the housing sector. He recognizes all this, and he does it while it's still profitable. He continues to sell the lumber while it's still profitable. As soon as there is no longer profits to be made, he will stop that activity. And I'll give another example that's more directly related to the actual housing construction project itself, like where, let's say, an entrepreneur is actually the general contractor in a housing development representing waves of housing, where there's subdivisions being created and waves of housing that are just being built, tract homes that aren't really needed as far as from the societal perspective, but he's continuing to build them because he's still making profit. Say that this individual is an Austrian economist, and he knows that there is a boom going on and that there's houses being made that aren't really needed by society, but he's still making profit at it. And he, in his mind, he's decided he's going to stop doing it as soon as it's unprofitable. And that's exactly what entrepreneurs did. We all witnessed housing development subdivisions where houses were just stopped right in the midst of construction, as that moment when that house could no longer be sold as a profit, where it was no longer viable to expend the money to buy the materials, to pay for labor, to pay architects and all the other expenses, including realtor commissions and everything else, that those projects were stopped in midstream, the moment they became unprofitable. But meantime, there were waves and waves of houses built and sold, and waves of subdivisions built and marketed and sold, where that general contractor made money during that process. As soon as it was no longer profitable, he stopped the expenditure of time and resources on making more houses when it was no longer profitable for him. And the same happened with other people, realtors and mortgage bankers, people who worked at title companies, all the people that were part of that process. And then they were no longer in that housing production that they had been in. And it could have been, a lot of other people, like a person who owned a backhoe and who dug trenches for septic systems and plumbing and electrical and whatnot for the conduit to be run, that he did it as long as there was profit to be doing it. And then he did something else after that. So to basically say, as a core part of Austrian economics, a core part of that theory of entrepreneurial error is that the entrepreneurs could not make their calculations and that they were somehow fooled and that they somehow could not correctly calculate what would have been profitable. But they actually were not fooled. They actually did not make errors. They themselves continued to operate and make profits as long as it was profitable, and they stopped immediately as soon as it was no longer profitable. And those who did not do that were left out. So I think a better statement of this phenomena would be that from a societal perspective, from the perspective of society, mistakes were made. So I think a better statement of this would be to say that when a central bank makes this artificial credit, they make money out of nothing. They create credit out of nothing. Credit that's not sustained by the market's normal, the market interest rate. The interest rate usually changes based on people's time preference. To indicate like whether there's more of a need in the market for savings and to restore capital that's needed, or if there's actually a need for production to produce things for a market that has plenty of capital and is in a position to consume new products, and where the time preferences of individuals indicate that they would consume new products. This is all in the free market sorted out by the market rate for interest rate being set in the market, so that savers will save when saving is needed, and projects will be undertaken when they benefit society. So I think a better way to state this, rather than to call it entrepreneurial error made by entrepreneurs where they're incorrectly able to calculate profit and loss, I think a better way to state it is that when a central bank gets involved, when an entity gets involved creating credit and creating money or fiduciary instruments, the perception that there is money, that the false credit creates a perception that there is money, credit that's offered at a lower interest rate, at an artificially low interest rate. What it does is it makes entrepreneurial effort no longer be geared towards the benefit of society. It's still geared towards the benefit of individual entrepreneurs, but the fact that the government got involved with the central bank creating this artificial credit by messing with the interest rates, it actually causes entrepreneurs to still gauge properly what will be for their benefit, but where the outcome no longer benefits society. Whereas if the central bank had not been involved, if interest rates were allowed to fluctuate normally in the market, entrepreneurs' activity and production of capital goods would have been synced up exactly with the needs of society, the goods that would have been used and desired in society. So this government-imposed artificial interest rate that causes excess production in one sector, whether it be education, houses, cars, medical, healthcare type services and expenditures, wherever the boom may manifest itself, those individuals in that industry, like say that there's an education boom in higher education, too much credit being thrown into student loans and whatnot, or in the medical field, too much money created by the government beyond creating artificial elevation of prices. The actual people that are benefiting from that are performing x-rays or producing equipment for the medical industry, the people that are actually profiting as they go along because they observe profits can be made, they're not really making errors for themselves. And also within Austrian Economics and classical economics, you can even discern that there can be an articulated difference between the entrepreneur and the capitalist, the one providing the capitalist. Sometimes those functions occur in the same person. The entrepreneur is also the capitalist. But the purely entrepreneurial function, let's go back to the guy who is the general contractor making a subdivision, actually building houses, waves of houses. But he's also an Austrian economist. That's his hobby, and he knows this is not sustainable. We're in a housing boom. But those things, those projects are usually financed by some bank, A lot of times it's not even the capital of the entrepreneur. There's literature on this and discussions on this, how you can actually dissect and distinguish, like, what is the entrepreneurial function? Does it reside in the same person as the capitalist function, or is there somebody providing the capital, and somebody else managing and directing and forecasting the needs for projects and where profits can be made? So, like in the housing boom, most of the capital was provided by somebody that was distinct from the person actually doing the entrepreneurial activity of laying out subdivisions and projects and building houses, building individual houses, and all those projects stopped right in the midst of whatever cycle they were of production, halfway built houses, once those houses could no longer be sold at a profit. So there was really no entrepreneurial error from the perspective of individual entrepreneurs. And then when you talk about a cluster of errors, a cluster of entrepreneurial errors where multiple entrepreneurs, the aggregate effect of all their errors is what turns into the bust, where it turns out that they were making mistakes and that they were doing things that actually was not for their benefit, and it turned out to be an error, but the entrepreneurs were fooled into thinking it was good wisdom, that it was a good choice they were making, when actually they were making good choices from their perspective. What happened is that the results were skewed where they no longer benefit society. So I think a better statement of the entrepreneurial error aspect of the boom-bust cycle of Austrian economics, the business cycle, a better statement would be to say that that central banks cause entrepreneurs to undertake actions that are not beneficial to society, whereas they are not beneficial to the economy as a whole. They're not beneficial to consumers that would have benefited from those products and from those goods had they been produced in a free market, in a market that had an interest rate that was a freely set interest rate. So I think that would be a better statement of the thing that is classically referred to as entrepreneurial error. And when it's aggregated, you have a cluster of entrepreneurial errors, and that's typically stated within Austrian economics, that the entrepreneur was kind of fooled in where he was harmed because he incorrectly forecasted his entrepreneurial activity. But he still actually forecasted it correctly for himself. What it did is it caused the normal activity of an entrepreneur, which is beneficial to consumers and to society, it caused that activity to no longer benefit consumers and to no longer benefit society at large. But it was not an error from the perspective of the entrepreneur in most cases.